Hello everyone, my name is Rasmus, and today I'd like to talk to you about how to resolve the properties of both minority and majority carriers using a single experimental technique, namely the photo hole. We use semiconductors in a wide range of different applications, but we need to understand the properties of both types of charge carriers in order to advance the efficiency of a given application, as well as develop new devices. If we take the example of photovoltaic devices, it is the majority carriers that determine the optimal device structure, the space charge region width, and the bulk series resistance. The minority carriers, on the other hand, determine other key parameters such as the lifetime, diffusion lengths, and recombination coefficients. So, in short, we need to study both carriers, which typically requires a wide range of experimental techniques using different sample configurations and illumination levels, all of which complicates the analysis. Furthermore, it's extremely difficult to extract this information reliably. But before we dive into the photo hole technique, just allow me to pick a semiconductor that we'll use as a case study. Trigonal selenium is an elemental wide bandgap semiconductor with an interesting quasi-one-dimensional crystal structure and a very high absorption coefficient in the visible region. As the trigonal phase is the only thermodynamically stable one under standard conditions, and the melting point is quite low, it is easy and potentially super cheap to fabricate, and it could be used as a photovoltaic absorber material. In fact, that's what we do here in the case of a single junction solar cell. As you can see from the cross-sectional SEM image, using only a 300 nanometer thin layer of selenium is actually sufficient to absorb and collect almost all the photons in the region of interest, and we demonstrate an efficiency of more than 5%. The performance at this point is mainly limited by a voltage deficit, which could be attributed to short minority carrier lifetimes. To further motivate the study of selenium, we also fabricated a selenium-silicon tandem solar cell. Even though this is still in its early stages of development, this device holds the potential to achieve higher efficiencies than single-junction silicon solar cells would ever theoretically be able to reach. To study the properties of the charge carriers that are currently limiting the performance of our devices, we could use the classical Hall effect. This technique is a workhorse in semiconductor characterization based on the Lorentz force. And if successful, the outcome is three carrier properties, namely the type, the density, and the mobility of the majority carriers. One downside is that we need to fabricate a Hall bar with electrical contacts to do that. And as we need to shine light on our semiconductor in a minute, we need to do it on an insulating and optically transparent substrate. What we actually measure is the magnetoresistance. But if we just consider the geometrical dimensions of the Hall bar, it is fair to say that the raw data we measure is the conductivity and the Hall coefficient. We did this on this selenium Hall bar, and our results showed a p-type semiconductor with a very low hole density and a somewhat low hole mobility as well. But we just hypothesized that it was in fact the minority carriers in selenium that were limiting the device performance, not the majority carriers. But what if we now shine light on the Hall bar? Well, now we photogenerate an excess carrier concentration of both majority and minority carriers. Therefore, the majority carrier density must be the sum of the dark carrier density and delta P, and the minority carrier concentration must be equal to that same excess carrier density as they are generated in pairs. The conductivity is now influenced by a contribution from both carriers, which may have different mobilities, and the Hall coefficient takes on this form where I have defined beta as the ratio of the two carrier mobilities. If we plot the conductivity and Hall coefficient, that is our raw data, as a function of the light intensity, we quickly run into a problem. This problem is called the two-carrier transport problem. And the problem is really that we have three unknowns in our transport equations at every light intensity. Our unknowns are the two different carrier mobilities and the excess carrier concentration. But there's a trick. First, we eliminate the dependence on the light intensity by plotting the Hall coefficient h as a function of the conductivity sigma. Okay, the next step is to calculate how two identical materials, with the exception of the minority carrier mobility, would actually look in such a plot. And here we see the first clue: the slope is different. So the sigma h slope contains some hidden information about the minority carriers. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the math here, but it is really simple. The result is that the derivative of this product, h times sigma squared with respect to sigma, gives you the whole mobility difference. So let's try that on our case study. We take our case study through the experiment and we observe a beautifully strong photo response and see that the whole mobility difference here in green converges towards 0 with increasing illumination. Okay, but what about the carrier-resolved mobilities? Actually, we just need to plug the equation describing the mobility difference into the conductivity and Hall coefficient equations, and then we can solve for the three unknowns from before. If we just solve for the mobility ratio that I defined earlier, the result is the solution to a quadratic equation, as you may be able to see here. With this at hand, we can write the three unknowns from the transport problem in a slightly more compact way. The only requirement for all of this to go well is that we need the carrier density measured under dark conditions. In the case of selenium, we see that both carrier mobilities are strong functions of light intensity. And had we blindly used the dark Hall analysis, not considering the excess photo-generated carriers, we would have underestimated the mobilities quite significantly. But why are the mobilities actually a function of light intensity in the first place? Well, there could be several reasons, such as filling of traps or defects. It could be the result of carrier screening, or even light-modulated intergranular barrier effects, which is shown to be the case for cadmium telluride. Another really important thing to note here is the nature of the measurement. We are assessing the mobilities under steady-state illumination, which is the condition relevant for photovoltaic operation. Now, we also calculate the excess carrier concentration and see almost an order of magnitude difference when blindly using the dark Hall analysis again. So it's really important to explicitly state not only under which conditions you carried out your measurements, but also the calculation models used when reporting these results. Finally, as we know the absorbed photon density G, and now also the excess carrier concentration delta N, we can calculate some form of a recombination lifetime and the corresponding carrier-resolved diffusion lengths. Under high injection conditions, the ambipolar diffusion length is probably more appropriate, but as you can see in our case, the differences are negligible. When we compare the photo Hall to other techniques, we see that we gain access to a lot of carrier properties using a single experimental technique. However, as I mentioned before, you need electrical contacts, you need a Hall bar, and these contact measurements could also influence the results. Therefore, I'm going to question how much sense there actually is to our results. And to do that, we fabricated a solar cell, characterized it using a combination of the other commonly used techniques, and tried to simulate the device performance. The photo-absorbing layer of this selenium solar cell was actually fabricated in parallel with the Hall bar. Now, as the main surprise from the photo Hall experiment was a very low dark carrier density, we decided to investigate the width of the space charge region using voltage-biased EQE as well as capacitance-based techniques. Now, had the intrinsic carrier concentration actually been on the order of 10 to the power of 12 per centimeter cubed, then the space charge region under short circuit conditions should be on the order of tens of microns. But we see a strong bias dependence in our EQE, as well as a profiling distance of 250 nanometers from CV and DLCP. These results imply that the dark carrier density should be at least 4 orders of magnitude higher than the results from the dark Hall measurements. Furthermore, if we then try to cool our sample down again in our Hall setup, we see that the dark carrier density drops 2 orders of magnitude. This implies that we have significant carrier freeze-out even at room temperature. So the carrier density from the Hall measurements do not seem to reflect the true acceptor density. We tried to model the ionization efficiency and found that the activation energy from the temperature-dependent Hall measurements implied acceptor densities at least 3 orders of magnitudes higher than the carrier densities. But carrier depletion from surface and interface defects could also contribute and explain why we're seeing such low carrier densities. And not only that, but such depletion effects may also explain why the apparent recombination lifetime was very high under low injection conditions, as the 2 carrier distribution functions have a quite small spatial overlap. As a result, the density of electrons and holes actually able to recombine with one another is low in comparison to the high injection case, where the distribution functions will smear more out as surface defects are saturated. We therefore turn to another technique to estimate the carrier lifetimes, namely time-resolved terahertz spectroscopy. And here we retrieve 2 characteristic decay times. This is not unheard of, but it's not that straightforward to actually pinpoint which carrier dynamic phenomena one should attribute to each characteristic decay. Another thing to note here is that the mobility sum was retrieved about half a nanosecond after the optical pump, but the value actually seems to match the low illumination photo Hall mobility. This could indicate that the shorter lived component is the effective carrier lifetime, and the carriers have already been localized during the longer decay, not necessarily recombined, but at least some form of localization. Therefore, as a final step, we turn to device simulations, and the first thing we see is that the rapid initial decay would actually explain our experimental VOC very nicely. However, we could only go up to 0.3 suns illumination during the photo Hall measurements, so the mobilities used here should be considered a lower bound. Furthermore, we concluded that the acceptor density is not necessarily equal to the measured carrier density. Therefore, we simulate the performance of our device while varying the acceptor density and carrier mobilities in tandem. And we find that given our device configuration, the measured fill factor can never be predicted with acceptor densities lower than 10 to the power of 16 per centimeter cubed. Okay. We therefore fix our acceptor density and simulate the mobility lifetime product that gives an optimal fit. Now, it's worth noting that there is a quite broad region of carrier mobilities and lifetimes that would result in a somewhat decent fit, but we at least got the orders of magnitudes on lock here. The final result is a near-perfect match of our experimental JV and EQE measurements, with a set of charge carrier properties that now quantify our current performance, but also our limitations. And with that, I'd like to thank all of my colleagues and collaborators that have been involved in this study.